Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about avoiding the disaster recovery RTO trap. So what exactly is RTO? It's a really good place to start. So RTO is the recovery target objective. It defines the maximum amount of time allowed for a recovery activity, whether it be a system, whether it be an application, whether it be a database. Typically, the maximum amount of time that you can afford for something to be down is defined as the RTO. Now, very important to understand, RTO should always be determined on the basis of business impact. It is a business decision. It's not an IT decision. And generally, how you're going to arrive at what your RTO should be is based on the cost per hour of that application, of that server, of that database being unavailable. So for instance, I worked with a food processor several years ago. They actually would pick produce, use an ERP to process it. They'd load it up within their distribution facility. They would send it out to other warehouses. From those warehouses, it would eventually make it to the grocery store shelf. Now, they had a very specific SLA with their end customers regarding freshness. And in order to meet that SLA, they could not afford any downtime at all. So what would happen is if that ERP system was down for an hour, any of that produce that was picked during that hour, they essentially just had to throw it away because they could no longer hit that freshness SLA. So as a result of 1 hour of their ERP system being down, that had a cost to the business of like $400,000 to $500,000. Pretty significant cost for just that 1 hour outage. So obviously they have a very aggressive RTO. One other thing to think of with RTO is this term is used both in the context of talking about resiliency, so surviving failures from a single point, as well as disaster recovery. For the context of this video, we're specifically talking about the disaster recovery scenario. Speaking of that, though, it's very important that you don't conflate disaster recovery and resiliency. So for instance, if you have a single server fail and that causes your application to go down and you want to declare a disaster because of that, you really don't understand the concept of disaster recovery. That's more of a resiliency scenario, and what is your plan to recover from that single outage of that server? So RTO, it's a trap. Okay, sorry, my apologies. I don't pull that off very well, but I love this meme, and it really does set up the tone for this presentation. When thinking of disaster recovery in the context of RTO, there is an inherent trap that you need to be aware of. So in order to illustrate this trap, let's basically walk through the timeline of what happens when there's some type of disaster occurring. So we'll say that in hour one, a disaster occurs. And by the way, this is assuming that you have an RTO of 24 hours on a given system. So in hour one, an outage occurs. Well, you might not actually decide that that outage constitutes a disaster until around hour five. It could be you making the decision. It could be based on feedback that you're getting from your hyperscale cloud provider, or it could be a managed services provider that's actually providing the disaster recovery services for you. So very important to understand that there could be a gap between the outage occurring and the disaster being declared. So once the disaster is declared, typically the ERP recovery process or the application recovery process begins. In this particular example, I'm using an ERP system. So that process runs for 22, 23 hours. And at the end of that process, the ERP is recovered. and you've achieved that 24-hour RTO that you were trying to get. So everybody starts celebrating, everybody starts popping and drinking the champagne, right? Well, maybe not, because maybe you've got dependent systems that have to be up and have to be available in order for the ERP to be used. Maybe that's LDAP. Maybe you're doing something with single sign-on. Maybe it's just basic network connectivity. Did you already have the plumbing in place? And so you're waiting on these dependencies, and these dependencies are outside of the ERP system itself, but without them, you really can't have your user base starting to consume those resources. So let's say all the dependencies are resolved, and now the ERP users are able to get in, start working with the system. So again, you achieved your 24-hour RTO, but you actually had a 51-hour ERP outage. That's not what the business thought that they signed up for. That's not the SLA that they thought that they had. So something very, very important to just be aware of is the difference between the outage time and the RTO time, depending on how you're defining these terms. So let's talk about how to avoid the RTO trap. So the first thing is make sure the RTO is always based on applications and it's not based on servers and databases. And the reason I say this is I've talked with customers before that have worked with different managed services providers over the years. And the managed service provider would tell them, hey, the servers are up, the database is up. But for whatever reason, the application's still not working. The application is not available. Well, it does you no good to say, hey, we contractually met our obligations, the servers are up. The servers, the databases are irrelevant. It's the usage of the business system, of the application that's important. The next thing is make sure that you're specifying who's responsible for application recovery. This is especially important in the context of a managed services provider. If you have a third party that's doing these recovery activities for you, are they just recovering the servers and the databases, or are they also responsible for making sure that that application is usable? So always define the starting point for your RTO as when the outage begins, not when the disaster is declared. In the case of a MSP or a managed services provider, make sure you get that into your contractual language. And then understand all of the application dependencies that are required for normal application usage. This is the thing that hangs up a lot of people. We've got the app up, we've got it restored, we've got it ready to go, but because of all of these other reasons, we can't actually use it. So any questions about the RTO trap, disaster recovery in general, or just using enterprise applications on hyperscale cloud? Feel free to reach out to me at paul@informedcio.com. Thanks so much for watching this video. Be sure to subscribe, and I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day. Bye.